Hi again. This is part 5 of Samuel Andrews' discussion of Christianity and anti-Christianity and their final conflict. Here, in his official introduction to the book, he's giving you the history of the interpretation of this doctrine from the early church to the present day, which was 1898. He starts, the term Antichrist is to many, perhaps to most Christians of our day, a term of great vagueness. But to the early Christians and to the church for several centuries, it was of very definite and fearful meaning. It designated the last and greatest of the enemies of God and of his Christ, an apostate who would sum up in himself all wickedness. Endowed by Satan with all his power, he would receive from him the kingdoms of this world and rule over the nations. He would make war with the saints and would overcome them and reign supreme for a little time. But he himself would be destroyed at the coming of the Lord. It is the purpose of this essay to inquire what the Scriptures teach concerning the Antichrist and his times, and how far we may see in the history of the Church and in the movements and tendencies of our day the foreshadowing of him and the preparation for him. This involves a consideration of the place of Christ in the divine purpose and of his person and prerogatives. But before entering upon this inquiry, it will be well to define the term Antichrist and to give a brief outline of the several phases of belief in the Church in regard to his person and work. The term Antichrist plainly denotes an enemy of Christ, but leaves indefinite whether a person or a series of persons, whether one arising from within the Church or without it, whether one who has appeared or is yet to appear. Nor does the word itself determine whether he is simply an enemy of Christ, or both an enemy to him and a substitute for him. Many find only the element of hostility. This certainly is the predominant idea, but does not exclude that of substitution. This appears if we note that the work of Christ in our redemption has two chief parts, that of atonement, the propitiation for our sins and the heavenly intercession based upon it, and that of judging and ruling, or the administration of the Messianic kingdom. The first of these Antichrist wholly denies. He will know no atonement, no cross, no priesthood. Here his hostility to Christianity is openly avowed. For the second of these, the Messianic kingdom, he will substitute an earthly kingdom, the elements of which will be fraternity, liberty, equality, and in which will be the highest development of man. It is here that he offers himself as a substitute for Christ. He will be the Messiah of the nations, and under him all will be blessed. As said by Archbishop Trench in his famous book on Synonyms of the New Testament, quote, he will not call himself Christ, for he will be filled with deadliest hate, both against the name and office, against the whole spirit and temper of Jesus of Nazareth, now the exalted King of glory. He will not assume the name of Christ, and so will not in the letter be a false Christ, yet assuming to himself Christ's offices, presenting himself to the world as the true center of its hopes, as the satisfaction of its needs, healer of its hurts. He will, in fact, take upon himself all names and forms of blasphemy, will be the false Christ and the Antichrist, both at once. In giving a brief outline of the various beliefs in the Church respecting the Antichrist, we find three periods clearly marked. First, the belief in the early Church, and in general down to the Reformation. Second, from the Reformation to the French Revolution. And third, from the French Revolution to the present time. In the first period, extending over some 15 centuries, there was not absolute uniformity of belief, but substantial agreement. To quote in detail the words of the early fathers would demand more space than we can give, nor is it at all necessary for our purpose. That there is such agreement is affirmed by all who have investigated the matter, both Roman Catholics and Protestants. Some quotations from the more recent writers will be sufficient here. It is said by Greswell, this is a direct quote from Greswell, quote, another article of belief on which the fathers are unanimous is this, that before the end of the world, Antichrist must be expected to appear. It made no difference whether they were advocates or opposers of the doctrine of the millennium in particular. In the reception of this opinion, there was perfect agreement among all parties. The fathers are likewise agreed in considering Antichrist to be a real person and not merely a figurative or symbolic character. They're unanimous that the appearance and rise of the Antichrist would be accompanied by the persecution of the followers of the true Christ, and that his kingdom would be established on the ruins of the church. That's the end of Greswell's quote. It is said by Bishop Wordsworth in his commentary on 2 Thessalonians, quote, "The general opinion of the fathers was that a personal Antichrist would appear a short time before the second coming of Christ," end of quote. In like manner, it is said by Todd in his discourses, quote, "All more ancient writers unanimously agreed that an individual Antichrist was described in the prophecy, and that he was to appear at the end of the world, immediately before the second coming of the Lord." End of quote. After stating the early opinions in brief, S.R. Maitland says, quote, "I believe that the opinions which I here attribute to the early church were held by all Christian writers until the 12th century." End of quote. And Professor John Eadie remarks in his essay on the man of sin, quote, "The man of sin was to be one human being, one man, was the first and prevailing interpretation." End of quote. So also John Henry Newman, in the patristical idea of Antichrist, he said, quote, "That Antichrist is one individual man was the universal tradition of the early church." End of quote. Perhaps these statements should be somewhat modified as regards the Alexandrian school. This agreement of the fathers embraced the following points. 1. That before the end of the world or age, there would be an apostasy, which in its culmination would be not merely a corruption of the Christian faith, but a total denial of it. An apostasy not universal, but very general. 2nd, that the last representative and leader of this apostasy would be a man, the wicked one, man of sin, son of perdition, or the Antichrist. 3rd, that this man would attain to universal dominion, all nations becoming subject to him. 4, that this dominion would continue but a short time, 42 months or 3.5 years. 5, that he would claim divine honors for himself and persecute all upholding the faith of Christ and suppress as far as possible all Christian worship. 6, that the time immediately preceding and during his reign would be one of great tribulation. 7, that many of the Jews would receive him as their Messiah. And 8, that he would be destroyed with his adherents by the Lord and his appearing. Besides these points of general agreement, there were diverse particular opinions about the person of the Antichrist, of which we may mention 1, that he was Satan incarnated; 2nd, that he was a son of Satan by a human mother; 3rd, that he was a man possessed by Satan; 4th, that he was a man who voluntarily gave himself up to do Satan's will and was endowed by him with miraculous powers, and to him Satan would give the rule of the kingdoms of this world; and 5th, that he was a man raised from the dead by Satan, and so a counterpart of the risen Christ. These were speculations not generally agreed upon. And here Andros goes on, the surmises of some of the fathers as to his birth in Bethsaida and his education in Babylon are of no importance. It was held by many that he was to be a Jew and of the tribe of Dan, chiefly on the ground that Dan is not mentioned among the sealed tribes of the Revelation in Revelation 7. It was said by Lactantius, for instance, and some of the fathers, that he would come from the east and subdue the west. The points enumerated as those of general belief in the first age of the Church are still held in substance in the Roman Catholic and Greek communions, and probably in the small Eastern sects. But some important modifications gradually came in, the grounds of which will be better understood after speaking of the nature of this apostasy. So we'll deal with that next time. I'll put in a link to what Justin Martyr had to say, and he was one of the first to speculate on the second coming and the and the reality of the millennium. This is in the middle of the 2nd century, by the way. So around 160, Justin Martyr writes about the second coming and the nature of the millennium, and links these thoughts, the thoughts of the book of Revelation, to Old Testament precedents, especially Isaiah. See you next time.